Today, we're tracing the journey of a hypothetical suspect through the criminal justice system, and we're going to do it by looking at some major landmark Philippine Supreme Court cases. You know, we hear about arrests, searches, and trials all the time in the news, but how do the constitutional gears actually turn when the state accuses a citizen of a crime? Today, we're going to break down that delicate, absolutely vital balance between law enforcement and your fundamental rights, using real-world scenarios that went all the way up to the highest court. Before we really get into the weeds, I want you to ask yourself this critical question about the balance between your civil liberties and law enforcement. If a police officer simply doesn't like the way you're standing on a street corner, is that enough for them to strip away your privacy and search you? Keep that specific scenario in the back of your mind as we uncover how the Supreme Court has historically answered it.
To make sense of all this, we're going to hit 4 main areas today. Number 1, the shield of privacy. Number 2, limits of stop and frisk. Number 3, the private search exception. And number 4, proof beyond reasonable doubt.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the shield of privacy, focusing on the classic case of Stonehill v. Diokno. Okay, so to understand how the state is restricted from just indiscriminately gathering evidence against you, we have to talk about the exclusionary rule. Basically, this is the ultimate penalty for law enforcement if they overstep their constitutional bounds. The exclusionary rule means that if the police break the rules to find evidence against you, they literally cannot use that evidence in court. It becomes what's known as fruit of the poisonous tree. And this is a huge deal because it completely shifts the dynamic, forcing the state to play strictly by the book. The absolute necessity of this rule becomes crystal clear when you look at the 1967 corporate raid case of Stonehill v. Diokno. In this situation, the warrants the authorities used just cited a super vague general violation of various laws and allowed agents to seize all business records. I mean, basically everything in the office. The Supreme Court totally struck those warrants down, ruling that a valid warrant has to specifically describe the offense and the exact items to be seized. It's designed to prevent law enforcement from just going on a blind fishing expedition through your private life. There's this incredibly powerful quote referenced in the Stonehill ruling from Justice Learned Hand that hits the nail on the head. It perfectly answers that common everyday complaint you hear, why let a potentially guilty person go free just because the police made a mistake? Well, it's because if the government can profit from breaking the law to get evidence, they're never going to have an incentive to respect your constitutional rights. Exclusion is the only practical way to keep that immense power in check. All right, moving on to Section 2, the limits of stop and frisk, diving into Malacat versus Court of Appeals. So let's step out of the corporate boardrooms and onto the chaotic streets of Plaza Miranda. Sammy Malacat was stopped and searched simply for looking suspicious while standing near a historically notorious bomb site. Basically, police officers claimed they observed a group of men whose eyes were, quote, moving very fast. The police approached, the men ran. And when they finally caught Malacat, they claimed to find a grenade tucked right into his waistline. Here's the thing. Normally, for a valid warrantless arrest, an officer needs to catch you in flagrante delicto, which is just a fancy legal phrase for being caught in the act. And standing on a street corner with shifty eyes? Yeah, that definitely doesn't count. He wasn't holding a grenade out in the open. He wasn't attacking anyone. Actually, this exact principle was hammered home again in the 2010 landmark case of People v. Commod. In Commod, the Supreme Court ruled that police absolutely cannot just arrest and search someone based solely on an unverified tip from a secret informant. There has to be more to it. So, circling back to Malacat, the Supreme Court actually acquitted him. Why? Because mere darting eyes, just like that unverified tip in the Commod case, simply do not meet the super strict requirements for a stop and frisk. A police officer must have a genuine reason, based on specific, unusual conduct, to believe a person is actually armed and dangerous. The court noted it was dusk, the officers were pretty far away, and there wasn't even a visible bulge on Malacat's clothing to suggest a weapon. The takeaway here? A hunch is never enough. You cannot summarily arrest and search someone just because they look a little nervous. Okay, let's shift gears to Section 3, the private search exception, looking at People versus Marty. This is a really fascinating loophole. What happens when it's not the police doing the searching, but just an everyday citizen? Well, in this case, a man named Andre Marti brought some packages to a private shipping agency destined for Zurich. The proprietor, Joe Breas, just following his standard operating procedure, inspected the packages before sending them off. Because he smelled something weird, it was Reyes, a completely private citizen, who opened the box first.
And inside, the sender had cleverly hidden dried marijuana leaves stuffed inside cellophane, sticking out of gloves, packed under cigars, and even pressed into bricks disguised to look like books. But despite all that pretty elaborate effort, the proprietor's standard final inspection uncovered the whole illegal shipment, entirely without police intervention. He found the weed, called the National Bureau of Investigation, and then opened the rest of the boxes with the agents just standing there watching. And here is the absolute heart of the Martis ruling. It's a massive distinction in constitutional law. Because the proprietor acted totally on his own initiative and not as an agent of the state, the constitutional rights of the accused were not violated whatsoever. The Bill of Rights governs the relationship between you and the government, not between you and two private individuals. Because the police didn't order the search, that marijuana was perfectly admissible in court, and Martis' conviction was solidly upheld. Finally, we reach the courtroom for Section 4, Proof Beyond Reasonable Doubt, examining the murder case of People versus Dramayo.
7. That's the total number of men accused of conspiracy in this incredibly brutal murder. Dramayo and Ecubin wanted to kill the victim to stop him from testifying in a robbery case, so they gathered 5 other guys and laid an ambush. But, as we're about to see, just because you are accused does not mean you're guilty in the eyes of the law. The trial court had to painstakingly sift through the evidence to figure out who actually committed the crime versus who was just present. Dramayo and Ecubin were convicted because witnesses proved they were the ones who physically struck and stabbed the victim. But look at the others. 2 of them became state witnesses, and the remaining 3 completely acquitted. Why? Because the prosecution couldn't definitively prove they actively helped in the killing. One guy even had a rock-solid alibi that he was out at sea fishing. The Supreme Court ultimately upheld the convictions of Dramayo and Ecubin based on this really beautiful standard for reasonable doubt. They said that while absolute, 100% certainty isn't required, moral certainty is absolute. You don't need a 4K video recording of the crime to convict someone, but the judge's mind must genuinely rest easy. For the 3 guys who were acquitted, the judge's mind simply could not rest easy. The evidence was lacking. It's a crucial reminder that the burden of proof lies entirely on the state. You don't have to prove you're innocent. The state has to prove you are guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over. Think about that fragile, fascinating balance between our fundamental freedoms and the pursuit of justice. From the fancy corporate suites of Stonehill to the chaotic streets of Plaza Miranda, and finally to the solemn courtroom of Dramayo, the rules of the game are strictly defined to protect you. Yes, the state wields immense, incredible power, but that power is kept on a very tight leash by the Constitution. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the law shapes the world around you.